Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking source material that details what is arguably the most massive wealth extraction in human history. We're looking at nearly 500 years of complex, world-shifting events surrounding India's colonial era. This is a genuinely dramatic story full of global trade, unbelievable betrayal, and just total ground-up transformation. Okay, let's dive right into this core mystery. Just think about it for a second. How does a group of merchants, guys who literally just set sail looking to buy some spices and textiles, end up becoming the absolute rulers of a vast, incredibly diverse subcontinent? I mean, it sounds like the plot of a movie, right? But it's exactly what happened. Now, to understand how they pulled this off, we first have to understand what India was actually like before these ships even showed up on the horizon. Because the stakes here, they were incredibly high. According to historical data, before European colonization, India was an absolute global economic powerhouse. We're talking about a region holding roughly 1/4, yes, 25% of the entire world's GDP. India was busy exporting highly valued goods like spices, cotton, ivory, and gems through these massive ancient port cities. They'd been trading with the Greeks and Romans for over 2 millennia. This place was the legendary Golden Bird. So here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The Golden Bird's allure, 2. From traders to rulers, 3. Strategies of conquest, 4. The $45 trillion drain, 5. Rewriting Indian culture, and 6. The 1857 rebellion.
Let's start with part 1, the Golden Bird's allure and the arrival of European powers.
Driven by the promise of massive economic advantage and some really fierce European rivalry, multiple powers set sail for Asia. It actually kicks off in 1498 when Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama lands in Calicut. Soon after, you've got the Dutch and the French following suit, all looking for their piece of this incredibly lucrative market. But the major shift? That comes in 1600 when Queen Elizabeth grants a royal charter to form the British East India Company. This eventually sets the stage for their total dominance at the 1757 Battle of Plassey. Moving on to part 2, from traders to rulers, the actual turning point. So the crucial point is that 1757 Battle of Plassey. This marks the exact moment the British stopped playing polite guests and actively seized territorial control over Bengal, which happened to be the absolute richest province in India. But here's the thing, they didn't win this battle just by having a superior military. Actually, scratch that. It was mostly a backdoor conspiracy. British commander Robert Clive struck a secret deal with Mir Jafar, who was the trusted military commander of the young Bengal Nawab. Mir Jafar literally held his own troops back during the fight, essentially handing the victory to the British in exchange for being made a puppet ruler. This one single act of betrayal practically altered world history overnight. Which brings us to part 3, strategies of conquest, how Britain took control. You know, shipping an army all the way from England for every single skirmish across a massive subcontinent, totally unsustainable. It was way too expensive. So the British got incredibly calculated with their administrative methods. First, they introduced the subsidiary alliance. They basically forced local Indian kings to disband their own armies and instead pay to host British troops. Talk about a shakedown. Next was the doctrine of lapse, famously enforced by Lord Dalhousie. This rule stated that if an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, the British would simply annex the kingdom, completely ignoring any traditionally adopted successors. And finally, the classic divide and rule. They actively exploited existing rivalries and social divisions between regional rulers. Slowly but surely, they systematically stripped kings of their sovereignty, creating this sprawling empire of puppet states. Part 4, the $45 trillion drain, the climax of exploitation. Once they were in power, the colonial administration's sole focus was extracting maximum revenue, no matter the cost. And the human cost was just devastating. In 1770, a catastrophic famine struck Bengal. Now, instead of helping, the British completely refused to lower their massive land taxes. Worse, they actually continued to export immense quantities of grain back to Europe. Because of this, approximately 10 million people starved to death. That was 1/3 of Bengal's entire population wiped out, while the company just kept maximizing its profits. It's truly a dark chapter. And the sheer scale of the financial extraction is just jaw-dropping. Based on the meticulous work of early Indian economists like Dadabhai Naoroji, we have a clear picture of what became known as the drain of wealth.
It is estimated that the total wealth systematically drained from India during the colonial era equals a staggering $45 trillion in today's money. $45 trillion. This unimaginable sum was essentially funneled right out of the subcontinent to fuel Britain's own industrial revolution, leaving India entirely impoverished in the process. On to Part 5, Rewriting Indian Culture and Dismantling Traditions. To really solidify their control, the colonial power realized they had to move beyond just land and revenue. They needed to target the mind. They started systematically dismantling indigenous governance and traditional schooling. To understand the sheer arrogance driving this, you just have to look at Thomas Macaulay's 1835 education policy. He literally stated, "A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." Wow, right? The administration used this stated sense of cultural superiority as their direct justification for replacing centuries of local knowledge and tradition with their own system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast. Pre-colonial Indian education happened in gurukuls and madrasas. It was open, it was dynamic, and it focused on a whole diverse range of life skills without rigid syllabi. But the new British system completely bulldozed that. They brought in rigid Western education and English medium instruction. The ultimate goal wasn't enlightenment. It was essentially a factory system designed to manufacture compliant English-speaking clerks who could help them run their own empire. And the economy faced the exact same aggressive restructuring. Before colonial rule, as we established, India was a global textile household with these brilliantly self-sufficient village economies. Under colonial policy, massive deindustrialization. Incredible Indian artisans were forced into total poverty. India was basically reduced to being merely a supplier of cheap raw materials, particularly raw cotton. And then, in a brutal twist, Indians were forced to buy back the expensive British-manufactured clothing that was made from those very same raw materials. Let's look at Part 6, the 1857 Rebellion, the breaking point.
You can only push people so far, right? Decades of devastating economic ruin, brutal policies like forced indigo farming, and profound cultural disrespect, it couldn't be contained forever. This simmering anger finally exploded. The immediate spark was a rumor that new military rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which deeply offended both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But it quickly snowballed into a unified war of massive resistance. We saw amazingly brave leaders emerge, like Mango Pandey, Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, and Begum Hazrat Mahal of Awadh, leading millions across northern India. It was a fierce resistance, for sure, but ultimately the British crushed the movement with horrific, unimaginable violence, quite literally burning down entire villages in retaliation.
But the immediate aftermath of this massive rebellion changed the administrative landscape of the country forever. Step 1. The British government finally realized that a private corporation could no longer manage a subcontinent, so East India Company rule was officially terminated. Step 2. They passed the Government of India Act of 1858. Step 3. Queen Victoria assumed direct formal control. This began the era of Crown rule, administered locally by a powerful British viceroy. Crucially, though, while the rebellion was put down, the events of 1857 inadvertently planted the very powerful seeds of modern Indian nationalism. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate takeaway from our sources today. When we look objectively at the facts, the massive wealth extraction, the devastating famines, the deliberate deindustrialization, we get a very clear definition. Colonialism in India was absolutely not some benevolent civilizing mission, even though it was often framed that way in older European textbooks. No, it was the systematic subjugation, exploitation, and brutal repression of a massive, wealthy nation, explicitly for the economic benefit of another. So I want to leave you with a truly stunning final thought to ponder. If that incredible wealth, that estimated $45 trillion, had actually remained within the subcontinent, if it had been used to fund its own infrastructure, its own education, and its own industries, what would India's history and its place in the world look like today? It's a profound question and one that really reshapes how we view modern global economics. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring the deep, lasting impacts of this history.